Right, you want to kick us off, Debbie, please?
Okay.
Welcome everyone to this month's Liverpool Dementia and Aging Research Forum. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Catherine Talbot, who's a lecturer in psychology at Bournemouth University and a cyber-psychologist, so quite interesting today. And she will be talking about her research into digital technology usage in people with dementia, including during the pandemic as well. And if you are on social media, it'd be great if you want to use the hashtag Liverpool Dementia and kind of engage in a conversation throughout, and we'll be picking those tweets up as well. But also, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments throughout, please just post them in the Q&A and we'll be picking them up at the end. So Catherine will be giving her talk for about half an hour, a little bit more than that. And then we'll have about 10-15 minutes of a Q&A to answer your questions. So over to Catherine now and enjoy the talk. Thank you for joining.
Yes, so hello everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Clarissa. So as Clarissa said, my name is Catherine and I'm a lecturer in psychology at Bournemouth University. And as Clarissa said, my expertise is in the field of cyber psychology, which is a really fascinating and exciting field. And for those of you who don't know quite what that is, it's the scientific interdisciplinary area that focuses on the psychology of human interaction with digital technologies. And I also am a committee member of the British Psychological Society Cyber Psychology section. So most of my work before COVID-19 focused on social media and young onset dementia. But today, as Clarissa said, I am going to be talking to you about some research I conducted with Professor Pam Briggs at Northumbria University that looked at how people with early stage dementia use digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I have included a QR code there as well, which you can scan and it will take you straight to the paper. And there's also my Twitter there and my email if you wanted to get in touch. So let's make a start. So it would be a bit of an understatement to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused significant global disruption, but its impacts have been particularly strong for people with dementia. And since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been much research that's highlighted the powerful impact that the pandemic has had on this group. And this is something that myself and Professor Pam Briggs reported in our first published paper, which was published in Age and Aging. And in this study, what we did was we interviewed people with dementia about the impact that the pandemic had had on their lives. So in this first paper, we found that people with dementia reported an increased deterioration in cognitive function, where they noticed changes in their speech, they noticed changes in their memory, and also in concentration. And they attributed these changes to a lack of cognitive stimulation and also a lack of rehearsal of everyday activities during the lockdown periods. And we also found that people with dementia, they reported a reduced sense of self-worth during the pandemic and heightened levels of social isolation and loneliness. And for many, this really stemmed from being able to access their support groups or to be able to take part in activities that they found meaningful, such as their walking groups or visiting allotments, for example. And all of this suddenly halted overnight. And this was a really difficult time for the people who we spoke to. And many of them said it actually put them back to this point at which they were first diagnosed with dementia, where they felt a bit lost. They didn't know what to do with themselves, and they suddenly started to question their identity again. And these are findings that have also been reflected in other people's work as well, such as Clarissa's and her team's wonderful papers on the impact of COVID-19 on people with dementia and their carers, and also reports by the Alzheimer's Society. So where does technology fit into this? Well, my thinking was that digital technologies could help us to combat some of these challenges, given their potential to facilitate social connection and their potential to facilitate communication. But to my knowledge, this hadn't yet been investigated in the context of the pandemic. And I do also, just right here, want to take a moment to just step back and think about a time before the pandemic, if you can do that. So the potential benefits of digital technologies may not just be limited to lockdown periods for people with dementia, but they could also be really valuable in dealing with the social impacts of the diagnosis itself. And this is something that I've been thinking about in my research before the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, we know that receiving a diagnosis of dementia, this can negatively impact a person's sense of identity. So others can start to see them differently, and they can also view themselves and their abilities differently during this difficult time. Well, from the cyber psychology literature, with other groups of people, we know that technologies such as social media can provide a really valuable source of identity. And this is something that I've come across in my own work with LGBTQ+ groups, where we found that social media provides a space where these people can really explore and make sense of their emerging identities and really learn what it means and figure things out. So therefore, I realised that this might also be true for people with dementia, who are a group that experience particular issues of identity. And then we also know that post-diagnosis, that can be quite a lonely and isolating time where many people, they report a reduction in meaningful social roles and also changes and losses in social relationships. And other researchers have theorised that people with dementia, they can experience a shrinking world after being diagnosed. And this refers to a reduction in the number of places in which the person feels comfortable, which ultimately that impacts on their independence and their well-being. And this is something that I found was actually exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic in our first paper, where the worlds of people with dementia, it started to shrink and they felt less comfortable going outdoors, and this created problems once we came out of lockdown. And this was because of a perceived symptom progression and also a loss of confidence. So digital technologies may actually be incredibly valuable for people with dementia in tackling these social issues. So by facilitating social connection, by facilitating communication, and by facilitating a sense of identity. Digital technologies, they may not only combat the isolation that accompanies lockdown periods, but also the isolation that often accompanies the diagnosis itself, and therefore provide a way of expanding the social worlds of people with dementia. So there is a greater need to understand the ways that digital technologies may enhance the lived experiences of people with dementia. And this has become more important during the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when I'm sure all of you will agree that digital spaces have really become a necessity for many people. And also, if we think about recent medical and policy initiatives as well, they've focused on diagnosing people in the early stages of dementia. So it's becoming increasingly important to support those with the diagnosis to live well, and digital technologies may provide some solutions there. So the COVID-19 pandemic, it's brought new digital opportunities and also new digital challenges, and therefore it provides this unique opportunity to really understand how people with dementia have adapted to this new digital landscape. And it was this that led me to my research question, in which I asked, how did people with mild to moderate dementia use digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic? So just so you're aware, in our research, we took what is known as a critical dementia stance. And in human-computer interaction research, this is a stance that goes beyond purely viewing people with dementia in terms of cognition, in terms of loss, and in terms of disability. And it also goes beyond viewing computers and other digital technologies as simply tools for work. Instead, the approach we took recognises the needs of people with dementia and views them as whole people, and investigates how can digital technologies support their abilities, how can it support their identities and their sense of self, and how can it support their potential. And I do also just want to point out that we took quite a positive approach to technology here, and that is also reflective of my approach to cyber psychology. So we're mainly focusing on how technologies can be used to enhance personal experience. So that's how can these technologies promote their well-being, and how can it also promote their higher level needs too. But that being said, we were also attuned to the idea that things really do need improving, and people with dementia will likely have experienced many challenges when using digital technologies during this really difficult time. So, for example, we were aware that people with dementia may have faced difficulties accessing digital technologies. They may have faced issues with digital literacy, and also the symptoms of dementia may make it difficult to use digital devices. It's also possible that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated already existing inequalities and a digital divide. And this is not only really the case for people with dementia, but also for other groups of people too, who might not have ready access to the internet or sufficient digital literacy skills. So this is why this research is so important, because it's essential that we identify ways in which digital spaces can be improved. So this is why we also investigated the challenges that people with dementia faced when using digital technologies, so that future adaptations can be made to really promote their digital inclusion. So how did we do this? Well, so to investigate the use of digital technologies by people with dementia during the COVID-19 pandemic, I interviewed 19 people living with dementia. These interviews took place between June and July 2020, which was as restrictions first started to ease in the UK. The interviews were conducted remotely because of social distancing measures, and these took place in a variety of formats, which was dependent on the participants' preference. So some were done via video calling software, so kind of like we're doing now. Some were done on the telephone, and some were also done via email. So we really wanted, if someone wanted to take part in this study, we wanted to make it as easy for them and to be as inclusive as possible and use the method that was best for them. And as I said, I interviewed 19 people living with dementia in total. There was 12 males and 7 females. And we had quite a range of ages, with the youngest person being 50 and the oldest person being 84. But on average, our sample was quite young, with the average age of 62, but I will return to that later to discuss what this really means. And yeah, 14 people lived with family members and 5 lived alone. So none of the people we spoke to lived in a care home, and all were living with mild to moderate dementia. It's also important to note that all participants reported using technology to some degree. However, some participants did only start using certain types of technology, such as social media and video calling software, during the pandemic. So it was still a new skill for them to learn. We analysed our interview data using thematic analysis, and we grouped these findings into 5 key themes, which I'm going to go through with you now. And these were technologies to assist with everyday life, technologies for social connection, technologies to feel good, technologies to find meaning, and hypercognitive technologies. And really, our findings, they speak to the adaptability of the people with early stage dementia who we spoke to, who sought out and used these digital technologies to counter the stresses of the pandemic. And this really demonstrates their digital agency and also a willingness to learn how to use digital technologies. So I'll go through each of these with you now. So participants, they often spoke about using digital technologies to support everyday life during the pandemic. So for some of the people we spoke to, and I think as I mentioned earlier, the outdoors became increasingly unfamiliar during lockdown, and participants reported getting more frequently lost when they were going on their walks, or just feeling less confident when going out on walks and leaving the house. And they attributed this to not leaving their home as often during lockdown. So to overcome this issue, some participants used digital tools to orient themselves. So one person reported using Google Maps more often, and another person said they were taking photographs on their mobile phone when they went for walks of landmarks so that they could find their way back. And this gave them a sense of confidence. And also by using technology in this way, they were able to continue engaging with the outdoors, be confident outside, and also maintain their independence. But one of the key ways in which people with dementia used digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic was for online grocery shopping. So they said they used online shopping because they felt unable to visit stores offline. This was for a number of reasons. Primarily, it was due to a lack of dementia-friendly practices in stores offline, which participants said had gone completely out of the window once lockdown started. And then they also didn't feel comfortable shopping offline due to concerns about contracting COVID-19 and also practical issues with shopping too. So therefore they turned to online shopping, and while some people did have some success with this, for many it was actually a real challenge because they were unable to obtain a delivery slot. So in part this seems to be due to the fact that people with dementia were not being classed as vulnerable. This caused many of them to feel forgotten, to feel sidelined, and as a result, many people reported feeling really anxious about whether they would be able to obtain their groceries, and often they became reliant on the goodwill of family members, neighbours, and others in their local community. For example, as this one person says here, we couldn't get on to do the online shopping because there was no spaces left. There was nothing set up for any help for shopping. I don't think they looked at the people with dementia as being vulnerable. So while digital technologies for activities such as online shopping may be hugely beneficial in theory, they're actually only really effective in supporting those most vulnerable in society when they align with effective policy. So this really just highlights the need as well for increased recognition of the needs of people with dementia to support equitable access to basic essentials. And then another way in which participants used technology was for social connection. So they used technologies to combat the enhanced levels of loneliness and isolation during the pandemic. So specifically, they used video calling software such as Zoom and social media to connect with their peers and access much needed support. And actually quite a few of the people that I spoke to about this said that being able to speak to with other people with dementia outside of their home was a lifeline during this time. So many of them missed their support groups, and this was a way that they could remain connected and could share strategies on how to cope with the stresses of the pandemic and also speak to others with whom they shared similar difficulties. So as this person says here, it was hard, it was, to see it day after day. It's the same old every day. It's a good job I have people to talk to online because it could have been a lot worse. So some people, for example, they said that they couldn't really speak openly about their dementia with the people in their household whom they were in lockdown with. But when speaking with their peers online, they could speak authentically about their dementia. And this was really important. It was important for them to talk about how they were feeling, and it was quite therapeutic. And there was this one really, really nice quote, which I've just put up there, from one participant who said, "We used to be united against dementia, and now we're united against COVID-19, which just really highlights the kind of sense of community these participants felt with others with dementia, and really the importance of these social groups that were sustained through technology. And there really seemed to be this kind of collective or community sense of identity among the people with dementia who attended these virtual groups. So in turn, this seemed to enhance well-being and also provide a protective buffer against the isolation that accompanied lockdown measures. And interestingly, so for some people, the video conferencing software such as Zoom, and they said that it made the dementia groups more accessible, primarily because it removed the need to travel, and travelling was a major source of anxiety for the people that we spoke to. So the people that I spoke to actually reported attending more dementia group meetings, meeting a more diverse group of people with dementia. And in turn, this actually expanded their social networks. And as if you think about it, it's also expanding their social worlds. They're meeting more people virtually. However, that wasn't the case for everyone. That was just a few people. And that being said, for many, the virtual connections weren't a direct substitute for offline peer support, and instead it was more viewed as the next best thing. So they couldn't have the physical offline social support, so this was the next best thing. And many said they really miss the physical expressions of support, which we know are quite common in the dementia world and are so important. Things that include things like a hug, a handshake, or a pat on the back, just to show someone that you're there and you support them. So while there were the benefits of these interpersonal technologies, it did not seem to be a direct substitute for in-person support, and it may not be suitable in its current form as a long-term means of support, although it was very useful during lockdown. And then participants also described using digital technologies to enhance their well-being and also to keep themselves occupied during this actually quite a boring time during lockdown. So they often struggled with being quite bored and there being a lack of cognitive stimulation during the pandemic, and therefore they turned to technologies to keep themselves occupied. So this included things such as playing games on devices such as iPads or on phones or laptops, and also again using video conferencing software to take part in activities. And this included things such as Pilates, aerobics, bird watching, and even viewing theatre performances. And when they were discussing using technology in this way, they often discussed it in terms of keeping their brain ticking over. So for example, one person here has spoke about using a Twitter chat, which they really enjoyed, because they could use it to find out lots of information, and they saw it as a way of keeping their brain active, and they found that helped with their symptoms of dementia as well, to make sure they were active during this time when opportunities for cognitive stimulation were actually quite limited. So these findings do kind of suggest that digital technologies may provide one way of facilitating cognitive stimulation, and this may be particularly important during periods of lockdown when, as I say, opportunities for stimulation are limited. And then we also found that participants use technologies to facilitate their higher level needs. So they use digital technologies to counter a loss of meaning and a loss of self-worth that they experienced during the pandemic, when they couldn't go out and take part in these activities that they usually would, from which they really got a sense of identity. So participants did this in several ways. Firstly, they spoke about using technologies for self-development and to work on themselves. So they used websites such as YouTube or, again, video calling software to attend classes and to learn new skills. And this was really lovely to see, and quite a lot of the people I spoke to did take up new hobbies during the pandemic, and they did attend these new classes and learn new skills. And by doing this digitally, they felt empowered to learn these new skills. They said that they didn't fear failing as much because they were doing it digitally and they were in the comfort of their own homes. So that was really nice to see. So this person here, for example, they started using YouTube to learn some crafting skills and find patterns that were suitable for them as a person with dementia, because they said they were struggling with the patterns they would normally use. But by using YouTube, they could find some that were more suitable, and also they could start and stop the video when they wanted, and they found this to be really useful. But for some of people, even just using digital technologies was a new skill, and it really provided them with this sense of achievement that they had accomplished something, and showed that they could learn new technological skills, and really they could adapt to this new digital landscape. And then there were also other digitally mediated activities that participants took part in, and these activities really engendered a sense of purpose. So for example, via technology, they were able to continue voluntary work if that was something they were doing. They were able to engage in advocacy. They were able to take part in religious activities. They were able to help others with dementia, and they were also able to take part in research. And these activities, they really helped them to enhance their feelings of self-worth And it really made them feel needed and like they were contributing to society during this very difficult time. And we know from research that meaningful activities are incredibly important for people with dementia, as it can preserve dignity and also preserve a sense of identity. Again, things that were really important during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that being said, it wasn't all positive. So the people we interviewed, they often described the challenges they experienced when using these digital technologies. And one key issue was that video calling software was particularly cognitively demanding. So I think many of us can probably relate to this actually, when using Zoom a lot at work or Microsoft Teams and feeling absolutely exhausted by the end of the day. But these effects did seem to be particularly strong for the people with dementia who I spoke to. They often reported having headaches, feeling fatigued, and also having enhanced problems with concentration after they'd spent quite a lot of time on Zoom. So as this person here said, I overused Zoom to start with. On the day, my eyes were dry and tired, couldn't concentrate. The day after would be a foggy day, meaning brain on a real go slow, could do nothing. And one reason for this might be that conversations via video calling software were perceived as being more cognitively demanding because there was a lack of non-verbal cues, so which we often take for granted in offline communication. So this includes things such as bodily contact, eye contact, gestures that might not be communicated in the little box in the screen, and also lip reading as well. Participants didn't feel able to lip read as much and kind of see what was really trying to be said. And this made it a bit more demanding, a bit more difficult, and could explain why participants were feeling quite tired for the next couple of days. So our findings really suggest that these cues may not currently translate well into online settings, and this can make online communication more difficult for some people with dementia. And participants also described some perceptual problems as well, where they found it difficult to process digital images. And this was quite hard sometimes with Zoom, with the borders. They found it quite difficult to make sense of the images. And some people also reported that it was more difficult to recognise people in online settings. And they felt that this created quite awkward situations, and it often made them feel quite embarrassed when they couldn't remember someone or excluded. So this person here was telling me a story of when they were on a group Zoom call and they couldn't remember anyone from the previous week. The names weren't in the corner of the boxes. They got quite flustered, quite upset, and they felt excluded and just left the Zoom call altogether, and then felt really upset after. So one simple way that we could overcome this is, when hosting a Zoom meeting, is to make sure that that little tick box is ticked in the settings to make sure that each user's name comes up when they attend a meeting. So then the person with dementia would at least have that name, and they would be able to see who that name aligns to. And it could also trigger the memory and remind them who it is. So it's just little things like that that we also need to consider. And really one of the key challenges was knowing how to use and how to navigate technologies, and also remembering how to use these technologies again in the future. So in fact, many of the people who we spoke to said they were often reliant on a family member to help them. So while this assistance was necessary, the people we spoke to, they didn't want to rely on family members. They wanted to be able to use technology independently. And for me, this also raises concerns for the many people with dementia who live on their own in the UK, who could be benefiting from these digital technologies, but perhaps don't feel able or don't feel empowered to use them. And this is an issue particularly during COVID-19 times, during the lockdowns, when someone couldn't just pop around the house to help you to set up some technology or show you how to use it. So therefore, we do really need to focus on empowering people and training people on how to use these technologies, but I'll come back to that again later. That being said as well, so some people did adapt how they use digital technologies to overcome some issues with their symptoms. And I found this really interesting, and it really highlights their willingness to continue using technologies. So, for example, some people reported that they were having issues with reading during the pandemic. So they started to make use of assistive software that would read the text to them, and they found this to be really helpful, and it meant that they could continue to engage with digital technologies. And then there were others who started to struggle with typing with their motor movements. So instead, they used speech to text applications so they could continue communicating with others via email. So as this person said here, they found this speech to text app and thought it was a really good bit of technology because it meant that they could continue communicating, which they'd actually stopped doing, they admitted. And as they say at the end there, it's great to have everybody to help you, but it's still nice to do stuff yourself. So actually, we need to find ways that we can use technology to promote the independence of people with dementia so that they can continue to use these digital technologies for as long as they want to. And these adaptations as well, I just want to highlight, were particularly important during the pandemic, given that opportunities for communication with people outside of the home environment was limited. And just to finish this little section up, there are also some simple solutions that could promote independent digital technology usage among people with early stage dementia. So this could include things such as training courses and dementia-friendly instructions on how to use technologies and how to identify which ones are appropriate for you. And one participant also suggested that accessible instruction cards could be sent to people with dementia that tell them a variety of things, such as how to set up a Zoom meeting, how to send an email, how to make a Twitter account, and how to tweet. And this could be really valuable, and both during periods of lockdown, but also outside of the pandemic as well, as it could promote their digital independence. And it might also promote their self-worth as well by helping them to develop their digital skills. So what does this all mean? Well, our findings suggest that digital technologies really hold great potential to boost the social connectedness, the well-being, and the self-worth of people with early stage dementia. So we found that these technologies helped many of the people who we spoke to maintain a sense of identity by continuing to feel like they were contributing to society, whether this be through activities such as digital volunteering or through learning new skills. And importantly, our findings suggest that the people we spoke to, they can't be viewed as passive users who just experience the pandemic. Instead, they're active agents who actively sought out technologies to meet their needs and to combat the stresses of the pandemic. And this is something which stands in stark contrast with a lot of dementia stereotypes and a public dialogue that often identifies people with dementia as victims. And that's definitely not something that the people I spoke to would identify with. That being said, I do just want to highlight some of the limitations of this work and some potential future areas of research. So the people that I spoke to were relatively young and they were living with early stage dementia. So they are not representative of all people with dementia, but nor do they claim to be, actually. And there's quite a lot of research as well that shows that it is the younger generations that are more engaged with digital technologies. So it isn't really surprising that the people we recruited did end up being younger. But, you know, we might also see a cohort effect here as well, where we might see that in future years, more people with dementia engage with digital technologies, and also as we make technologies more accessible for this group, digital technology usage among people with dementia will likely increase. So that's why this kind of research is important foundational research. Also, the people that we interviewed were recruited primarily via social media and also through dementia networks remotely. So therefore our sample would have been more likely to have positive views of technology, which certainly not the case for everyone with dementia too. And really consistent with this as well, the people we spoke to, they often recognise that they actually occupied quite privileged positions to be able to access and use the internet and digital technologies. which may not be the case for other people with dementia. For example, older people, people living in rural areas, or individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So therefore, future research, it might want to examine the barriers that people with dementia from more diverse backgrounds face and how these can be addressed. And that's something that I'm certainly interested in as well. So looking forwards, from this research, I firmly advocate that online spaces, as with offline spaces, should be accessible for and inclusive of people with dementia. So as I mentioned here, this is important because we may also see this cohort effect where younger generations who are more engaged with digital technologies age, and therefore we might see more people with dementia engaged in digital technologies. Therefore, it's really important that these spaces are inclusive of this group, particularly when they could be, helping to improve the lived experiences of people with dementia. And that's not to say that people with dementia are not able to use these digital technologies, more that these technologies have been developed in what's called a hypercognitive society. And that refers to a society which places which makes assumptions about a person's cognitive ability and therefore isn't tailored towards the needs of other groups. So therefore, designers, they could consider engaging with people with dementia throughout all stages of the design process and really making sure that these digital technologies meet their needs and identify innovative ways in which they can be adapted so that people with dementia can continue to use them as long as they are able and willing and want to. But also, it's not enough for these digital technologies to just be usable. They also need to be accessible. So particularly when these digital tools can be enhancing the lived experiences and combating all of these social challenges of dementia. So we therefore need to focus on enabling equitable access to digital devices and the internet. And finally, something which I'm really interested in is developing some sort of training which highlights the different technologies that are available to people with dementia and how they might be used and how they might be modified. And this could be particularly valuable for people who live alone or people who might not have support directly available to them. But then again, it could also be useful for anyone. However, I do firmly believe that it's important that any such training or resources is co-produced with people with dementia and that people with dementia are actually involved in running these sessions. They can show what these sessions should look like, what information should it contain, how can these ideas be communicated. And in turn, this type of evidence-based training, it could promote the digital engagement, the digital literacy, and the digital inclusion of people with dementia. So just to sum up, my research showed that people with mild to moderate dementia use digital technologies to facilitate social connection, to improve well-being, to promote self-worth, and to assist with everyday life. The people we spoke to, they viewed these technologies as vital in combating the social isolation, loss of self-worth, and lack of cognitive stimulation that accompanied the pandemic. However, there were challenges with participants experiencing cognitive fatigue and facing usability issues. And also in some cases, even when digital technologies were available that could assist with everyday life, these were ineffective due to policies that did not identify people with dementia as vulnerable and therefore provided a barrier to accessing basic necessities. So that is the end of my talk. As I said, there's my Twitter account and also my email and a link to the preprint. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would just like to discuss dementia and digital technologies.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Yeah.
Oh, I hear myself twice. So that was really fascinating. And if you have any questions or thoughts or queries, just pop them in the Q&A box. That'd be great, because now we're gonna take some questions, but maybe to kind of follow up on what you've just said, Catherine. I mean, yes, we've both done COVID research, but you've really honed in on the digital angle, which is fascinating. And I think it's such a timely topic as well. I suppose the pandemic is showcasing now that going forward, I know we're still in the pandemic and it will be some time, but possibly care in the future will be hybrid care, won't it? So hybrid model in terms of face-to-face, but also some remote access to care.
Yeah, 100%. I think with the pandemic has really showed the importance of these digital technologies and brought them to the forefront. And I think actually it's going to change a lot of care, it's going to change a lot of therapy, it's going to change a lot of various different areas of society that I think now are going to be hybrid. And, you know, so in some ways that's a good thing, but in many it raises so many questions about accessibility and who is being excluded from this, and what if people don't have access to these digital devices. A lot of the people that we spoke to, I was actually expecting to talk about say medical appointments and that sort of things via technology, but none of the people that we spoke to had appointments related to their dementia during that time. They were all cancelled. Nothing happened virtually. So I don't know if there is a bit of a postcode lottery going on there as well in terms of which services were quick to get up and running remotely.
So it's clearly important, not just for the care services they receive, but also linking up with their peers, isn't it? The digital technology and their families, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly, because, you know, very often it's not just people with dementia who are, you know, living in isolation. There's loads of people who come into contact, so there's the carers as well. And actually, so the people with dementia who we spoke to as well, they were very wary of making additional work for the carers as well, because very often these people, they did have to spend a lot of time setting up the technologies, learning how to use them themselves perhaps as well before they could show the person with dementia. And yeah, so there was quite a lot involved there.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a couple of questions come in, but I think picking up on your last or second to last slide, so what's your next step? Because there's so many avenues you could really go to. Are you now trying to design technology for dementia to be user-friendly, for example?
Oh, well, I have so many ideas, so much to do. So I think what I would be really interested in is conducting research to see what the barriers are at the moment. So the people who aren't using digital technologies, what were their experiences during the pandemic, and how can we get them engaged with digital technologies as well. As I said, I'm also really interested in developing training as well, the evidence-based training that is co-produced with people with dementia, as I think this could be really useful in terms of getting them engaged with digital technologies and enabling digital agency, but it would also have secondary outcomes of getting people with dementia together to socially connect with one another and to also improve their self-worth through learning these digital skills as well. But yeah, as well, I am really interested in developing technologies that are inclusive and working with designers of digital technologies as well, see how we can improve them, how we can modify them. Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping to do next.
Yeah, and it seems like some of the experiences that Annabelle has been posting here as well. So she said she's been looking at use of online exercise sessions during the pandemic. There were supposed to be classes for dementia, but they weren't really there, and it's very rare that people attempted to use any online classes. Did you pick that up in any way?
So for my online classes, it wasn't exercise that was brought up. It was mainly stuff to do with, so people were attending poetry writing classes, reading groups. There was the crafting classes as well. It was more that sort of thing. They didn't mention attending exercise classes actually, so that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, and was there any preference for the type of equipment that the people used in your research?
Yeah, 100%. And most of this is actually going back to my PhD research now, which came up quite a lot. The people I've spoken to, they tend to prefer to use iPads. And this is because it's touchscreen, first of all. It's preferable to a laptop or a mouse because they don't have to be using both. They don't have to be typing with one hand, using a mouse with the other, and thinking about all these various different things. So the iPad's preferable. Some people did like to use their phone, but in my experience, the phone screen's been quite small. So they prefer the iPad, which is much bigger, although phones are getting a lot bigger now. So yeah, so they generally had a preference for iPads.
Okay, yeah, yes, certainly phones are getting very big right now, as we've established before. So Bronte from the Alzheimer's Society has also kind of asking a comment, picking up on that hybrid comment that I made earlier. Do you, Catherine, are you interested in the potential benefits of a hybrid offer of support, and in what way that aligns with your research, particularly as your findings show that although virtual offers benefit, it did not offer itself as a direct alternative for face-to-face contact, which has been proven also in our research and in many other research.
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to explore a hybrid model of, say, support groups, because some of the people I did speak to did find it beneficial in terms of being able to meet more people and to attend a wider range of groups. But it was the physical aspect that was really, really important. So I wonder if it's certainly something I'm interested in, but I wonder if there could be certain events that are online, with the majority of it being in person, and having these certain events where you can put people with dementia into groups online and get them to chat and various things. But also thinking about that, I don't know if this is me being a bit skeptical and maybe being a bit negative here, but there might be future lockdowns, okay? There might also be another pandemic as well in the future, we don't know. So therefore, we do also need to make sure that these online support groups are really valuable as well, just in case this does happen again. I think that answers your question.
Yeah, and I mean, it's different in every country. So Germany is lacking behind with vaccination and all this. So it's not just the UK. Your findings can be applicable to so many different areas. So I've got a few more comments coming in here. So Catherine, are there any resources, sites or communities that you can recommend that we signpost people affected by dementia to in relation to that digital skills?
The Alzheimer's Society actually have a really helpful list on their website about digital technologies that might be helpful. So I definitely recommend having a look there. I'm not sure if I can find that link and get it sent out, but I'll tweet about it later anyway with the hashtag for this event. So that's where I would suggest looking. And I think the Dementia Empowerment and Engagement Project website might have a little something on digital technologies as well.
Okay, I'm sure Bronte from the Alzheimer's Society will have applauded you now for this comment. That's great. We've got a question from Hilary. Did the people with dementia in your research become more adept at using technology or less?
Yeah, so I would say that they became a bit more adept at using technology, and they did certainly say that they felt more confident as well as time went on, and that's because they kind of kept using it every day and kept pushing themselves. But they did say if they went a few days without using it, then they would find it quite difficult to get back to. So they definitely grew in confidence with that. But if this was a longitudinal study and we spoke to them over a longer period of time, it's likely that their technology usage may have become a bit less adept as dementia progresses. And that is also, again, something else I'm interested in exploring in. How does digital technology usage change as dementia progresses? And are there ways that we can adapt technologies so that people can continue to use them for as long as they want to and as long as they feel able to? Absolutely,
that's a good point, considering the whole trajectory of the condition as well. It's important to bear that in mind.
There is some research as well that has been conducted with people with more severe dementia than the people I spoke to, with very little digital experience, and that has actually showed that they can use digital devices for certain activities such as making digital art essentially and showing digital agency even in the later stages as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, great. So maybe one last question from Lena from Tide. So again, she says, thanks for the good talk, Catherine. Did any of the people you interviewed express concerns about digital or remote care replacing in-person care in future, kind of picking up on that hybrid model, I suppose, again?
Yeah, there were quite a few people, as I mentioned about it being the next best thing and really the only alternative. They did express concerns that this was going to be the future now, because of saving money and various other things, essentially. So they were concerned about it, and there were some who were quite distressed, really. And although the way that they were using the support services during the pandemic was really helpful, and as they said, a lifeline, they were actually really, really low, and they needed that physical aspects of care and those physical aspects of support as well. So it's like I said earlier about this hybrid model in terms of support. It could be quite useful, but the dominant bit should actually be the in-person.
Absolutely. So I think that's about all the questions we kind of have time to pick up on now. They're really interesting. So thank you everyone for joining. Thanks so much again, Catherine. That was really fascinating. If you could maybe move to the next slide.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So just to kind of present the next talk, which will be in November, and we will have Dr. Stephanie Harrison present us on how can big data help to improve the lives of older adults living in care homes. So I've put the link to that in the Q&A as well. But also we have something big happening in November as well, a couple of weeks before that. If you mind moving to the next slide, Catherine, please. We've got the 3rd annual conference happening, and again, because of COVID, we thought, well, obviously that has to take place virtually. So please feel free to sign up for that as well. Again, I'm just going to pop the link in the Q&A, but we've got a nice array of academic and non-academic speakers there, and not just from the UK, we've also got Polish and Colombian researchers involved, and we've got, for example, Sept, Liverpool House of Memories, and the Liverpool Dementia Action Alliance, and a carer presenting their experiences and talking about their services. So do join. But yes, again, Catherine, fab talk. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this talk.